name is Morgan. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one. I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm a project coordinator at a mid-size architecture firm, the kind of job where nothing dramatic happens, but everything falls apart if you're not paying attention. I've been married for 11 years, no children, a small house with a maple tree in the yard. From the outside, my life has always looked stable. People tend to describe me the same way: calm, reasonable, low maintenance. I don't raise my voice. I don't cry in public. I don't make scenes. If there's tension in a room, I smooth it over. If someone forgets something important, I quietly fix it. If someone misunderstands me, I usually let it go. What they don't see is that calm and quiet are not the same thing as small. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There was no explosive affair, no screaming match that shattered dishes against the wall. It's about something slower, quieter, harder to explain to people who've never felt it. It's about what happens when your thoughts are consistently minimized, when your reactions are labeled as too sensitive, when your concerns are waved away with a smile, when you slowly begin to doubt your own emotional temperature. I started keeping a journal because I had no one to talk to in my marriage. That sentence feels heavier than it should, because technically, I did have someone. I had a husband, I had friends, I had coworkers, but none of them felt like a safe place for my full interior life. My notebook became the only place where my feelings weren't dismissed as dramatic, and that's where this story really begins. What I'm going to share isn't revenge. It's not a triumphant takedown. There are no villains here in the cartoon sense. There are only patterns, blind spots, and one very quiet shift that changed the trajectory of my life. Over time, I learned something most people never notice until it's too late. Silence can be survival, but it can also be strategy. This is the story of how I went from being the dependable background character in my own marriage to someone who made a decision so calm, so measured, that by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already done. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate. I'll tell it the way I lived it, slowly, honestly, piece by piece. Have you ever felt alone in a room where technically you weren't alone at all? If you asked my husband to describe me, he would say I'm easy, not in a careless way. He'd mean low conflict, adaptable, understanding, the kind of partner who doesn't make things harder than they need to be. He has said those exact words before, usually as a compliment, to his friends. I was the thoughtful wife who remembered birthdays, the one who brought the right wine, the one who laughed at the right moments and didn't linger too long in conversations that weren't mine. At work, I was the glue, the person who caught mistakes before clients saw them, the one who sent follow-up emails at 6:42 a.m. with bullet points no one else thought to include. My boss once told me, if everyone were like you, my job would be effortless. I wore that like a badge for years. Being useful feels good. Being reliable feels even better. But somewhere along the way, usefulness became my primary identity. When people talked over me in meetings, I didn't interrupt. I'd circle back later with a polite clarification email. When my husband forgot to promise dinner reservations, a weekend plan, a small thing I'd mentioned mattered to me, I would say, "It's okay. I know you're busy." And I meant it, at least at first. There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't feel painful in the beginning. It feels mature, evolved, like you're choosing peace over ego. I told myself that I wasn't the type of woman who needed constant validation. I didn't need grand gestures. I didn't need long emotional check-ins. I just needed consistency. What I didn't realize was that consistency without acknowledgement slowly turns into erasure. In group settings, my husband often finished my sentences, not rudely, just confidently, as if he already knew what I meant better than I did. People would laugh. He's charismatic, quick, articulate. I would smile and let it pass. If I corrected him later gently, he'd say, "Morgan, you're overthinking it." No one interpreted it that way. No one. That phrase lodged itself somewhere quiet inside me. No one thinks that. No one noticed. No one took it that way. It's amazing how powerful no one can be, because if no one else sees it, maybe it's just you. Maybe you are sensitive. Maybe you are misreading the tone. Maybe you expect too much nuance from casual conversation. And so I adjusted. I spoke a little less in groups. I double-checked my reactions before expressing them. I filtered my concerns through a silent internal panel. Is this worth bringing up? Will this sound dramatic? Will this create unnecessary tension? 9 times out of 10, the answer was no. So I stayed the easy one, the steady one, the woman who didn't require emotional labor from others. What they saw was composure. What they didn't see was calibration. I was constantly measuring myself against an invisible standard. Don't be too much. Don't disrupt. Don't make him look bad. Don't make yourself look needy. And the strange part, no one explicitly asked me to shrink. That's what makes it so subtle. When people think of being overlooked, they imagine obvious neglect, birthdays forgotten, cruel words spoken, doors slammed. But sometimes invisibility is built from small permissions, small allowances, tiny moments where you decide your discomfort isn't worth the trouble. By the time I started keeping that journal, I had already trained myself to translate disappointment into silence. To them, I was balanced, reasonable, secure. To myself, I was becoming quiet in places that used to feel alive. And I didn't yet understand what that quiet would eventually cost. When I try to trace it back, the very first moment something inside me flinched. It doesn't look dramatic at all. It was a Thursday night, early spring. Still cold enough in Portland that the windows fogged lightly when we cooked. I had made lemon chicken and roasted vegetables. Nothing special, just routine. He came home later than expected. Not unusually late, just late enough that the food had gone from warm to reheated. I texted, he said, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. You did. I answered at 6:47. Dinner had been planned for 6:30. He kissed my cheek, already half scrolling through something on his phone. The guys wanted to grab a drink after work. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't. That's what I told myself. We sat down at the table. I asked about his day. He talked about a presentation, about a coworker who'd overcomplicated something simple. He has a way of narrating events that makes him sound like the reasonable center of every storm. Halfway through dinner, I said casually, lightly, "Next time. Could you let me know earlier? I would have timed things differently." There was no accusation in my voice, no edge. I was genuinely asking for a small adjustment. He leaned back in his chair. "Morgan," he sighed softly, almost amused. "It's not that serious." I smiled automatically. "I know. You're making it a thing," he continued. It was spontaneous. I can't schedule everything like a calendar invite. There was a subtle shift in the air, a gentle tightening in my chest. "I'm not asking you to," I said carefully. "I just like knowing." He looked at me for a second, not angry, not defensive, just faintly puzzled. Why does it matter that much? That question, why does it matter that much? I didn't have a concise answer prepared. I couldn't say. Because I planned, because I value shared time, because when you adjust our plans without consideration, it makes me feel peripheral. Instead, I shrugged. I said, "Forget it." And that was the first small cut. Not the latest text, not the drink, not even the sigh. It was the quiet negotiation that happened inside me afterward. On the surface, everything returned to normal. We cleared the dishes, watched half an episode of something neither of us cared about, went to bed at our usual time. But when I lay awake that night, I replayed the exchange. Was I making it a thing? Was I rigid? Was I attaching too much meaning to a small delay? I didn't want to be the kind of wife who monitored timestamps, so I told myself I wouldn't bring it up again. A week later, something similar happened. Then again, a month after that. Each time, the conversation followed a similar arc. "You're overanalyzing. It's not that deep. Why does it matter so much?" Each time, my request got smaller. "Just a quick heads up. Just earlier, if you can, just so I know." Eventually, even the just disappeared. I stopped asking. What struck me later, much later, was that no one else would have seen any of this as disrespect. If I'd described it to a friend, she might have said, "That's normal. Guys are like that." And maybe that's true. But what stayed with me wasn't the behavior itself. It was the pattern of dismissal. My feelings weren't argued against. They were minimized. There's something uniquely destabilizing about being told something isn't a big deal when your body registers that it is. It creates a split. Your intuition says that hurt. Your logic says don't exaggerate. So you choose logic. That night, the second or third time it happened, I opened a fresh notebook I'd bought months earlier. Black linen cover, unlined pages. I wrote, "Tonight I asked for a small courtesy and somehow ended up feeling unreasonable." Seeing it in ink did something strange. It steadied me. It validated that the moment existed outside of my head. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't collecting evidence. I just needed somewhere my experience wasn't reinterpreted before it could fully form. That's the thing about first cuts. They don't bleed dramatically. They don't demand stitches. They just teach you how much discomfort you're willing to normalize. And I was still in the phase of telling myself that love required flexibility. What I didn't yet realize was how often flexibility, when only one person practices it, quietly reshapes the entire relationship. After the first few small cuts, nothing exploded. That's what makes this kind of erosion so difficult to explain. If he had yelled, I would have had something solid to point to. If he had insulted me outright, I could have drawn a clear boundary. But what I was dealing with was softer than that, almost polite. It showed up in conversations that subtly bent away from me. For example, when we were out with friends, and someone asked what we'd been up to lately, I would begin answering, maybe mentioning a certification I'd started at work or a volunteer project I was considering, and he would interject. "She's being modest," he'd say with a grin. "She overthinks everything for months before making a move." Everyone would laugh. And technically, he wasn't wrong. I do think things through, but the tone carried something else. A faint undercurrent of hesitation in my deliberation was hesitation, that my caution was inertia. Once, I gently corrected him in the car afterward. I wasn't overthinking. I said I was evaluating my schedule. He glanced at me, surprised. "Morgan, it was a joke." "I know. I just didn't love how it landed." "You're reading into it again." Again. That word started appearing more frequently. You're reading into it. You're overinterpreting. You're projecting. It wasn't hostile. It was clinical. As if my emotional responses were small distortions of reality that needed calibration. And slowly, I began calibrating myself. Before speaking, I would rehearse how it might be received. Before expressing disappointment, I would rank it on a scale of 1 to 10. If it wasn't at least a 7, I told myself to let it go. If something bothered me, I waited 24 hours before mentioning it. By then, the urgency usually dulled, or I convinced myself it had. There's a quiet exhaustion that comes from constantly auditing your own reactions. I started telling myself a story. He's direct, you're sensitive. He's efficient, you're emotional. He's pragmatic, you're idealistic. Opposites balance each other, right? That's what I believed. But balance implies equal weight. What I didn't see at the time was that my emotional adjustments were doing all the compensating. There was one evening that stands out. We were discussing finances, nothing dramatic, just long-term planning. I suggested we increase our joint savings contribution slightly. I had run the numbers. I even printed a small spreadsheet. He scanned it quickly. "You don't need to stress about this," he said. "I've got it." "I'm not stressed," I replied calmly. "I just like having visibility." He smiled, not dismissively, not cruelly, just confidently. "That's why I handle it. So you don't have to." It was framed as protection, as care, but something inside me tightened. I didn't want to be protected from knowledge. I wanted to be included in it. Instead of pressing the issue, I nodded. "Okay," I said, and that okay became a pattern. Every time I felt the slight sting of being sidelined, I told myself I was choosing peace. Every time my perspective was softened, reframed, or gently corrected, I assumed he had a broader view. Every time I walked away from a conversation feeling subtly smaller, I blamed my own interpretation. Normalization doesn't happen in one dramatic shift. It happens through repetition. When the same dynamic occurs often enough, your nervous system stops reacting to it as a threat. It categorizes it as baseline. This is just how we communicate. This is just his personality. This is just marriage. I began journaling more consistently then. Not angry entries, not accusations, just observations. Tonight, he explained my own feelings back to me. Today I felt dismissed, but I can't prove it. I keep apologizing for tone, not content. Writing these things down wasn't an act of rebellion. It was self-preservation, because when something keeps happening but leaves no visible bruise, you start wondering if you imagined it. And I needed proof not for court, not for friends, but for myself. Proof that my internal shifts were real, that I wasn't again misreading. By the time disrespect becomes normal, it doesn't feel sharp anymore. It feels ambient, like background noise. You eventually stop noticing until one day, you realize it's been shaping the entire atmosphere of your life. And I was still convincing myself that endurance equaled maturity. I didn't yet understand the difference between patience and self-erasure. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer just a person, you're a function. I didn't notice it happening in real time. Roles rarely announce themselves. They settle in quietly, like furniture that's always been there. In our marriage, I had become the stabilizer. If he was frustrated at work, I absorbed it. If plans changed suddenly, I adjusted. If tension entered a room, I diffused it. At first, I wore that role with pride. Being steady felt powerful. It meant I wasn't reactive. It meant I wasn't fragile. But one evening, at a small dinner with another couple, something shifted in how I saw it. They were arguing gently about whether to move cities for a job opportunity. The wife was passionate, animated. She interrupted him twice. He interrupted her. There was friction, but it was alive. On the drive home, my husband shook his head. "I'm so glad we're not like that," he said. I couldn't deal with constant emotional debate. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "We've never had to debate moving cities," I said quietly. "That's because we're aligned," he replied. "You're not high maintenance." High maintenance? The phrase landed heavier than it should have. On the surface, it was praise. But underneath it was an expectation. Don't become complicated. Don't introduce friction. Don't require more than what's already comfortable. That night, lying in bed, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't aligned with him because we always agreed. I was aligned because I stopped contesting. There were decisions over the years that tilted subtly in his direction. Vacations are scheduled around his workload. Holidays were spent primarily with his family because mine was more flexible. Furniture choices he felt strongly about, while mine were just suggestions. Individually, none of these were worth fighting over. Collectively, they created a pattern. I was the accommodating one, the understanding one, the emotionally reasonable one. And the more consistently I played that role, the more it solidified in his mind. If I ever deviated even slightly, it felt disproportionate. Once, I disagreed with him in front of friends about a minor political topic. Nothing intense, just a nuance in interpretation. He laughed and said, "You've been reading too many think pieces." Everyone chuckled. I smiled, but inside, something cooled. Because what I heard wasn't playful teasing, it was repositioning. Reframing my opinion as influenced, less original, slightly naive. Later, when I mentioned that, it bothered me. He looked genuinely confused. "I was joking," he said. "You're taking it personally." There it was again, the unspoken rule. If something hurts, the problem is your sensitivity, not the behavior. Over time, I began to see the invisible script I had been handed. Be calm, be supportive, be undemanding, be proud of being undemanding. The role wasn't imposed with cruelty. It was reinforced with approval. You're so easy to be with. You never create drama. I don't have to worry about you overreacting. Each statement sounded like affection. But slowly, I realized something. He didn't have to worry about me overreacting because I had already done all the emotional filtering before anything reached him. He wasn't experiencing peace. He was experiencing the version of me that absorbed turbulence before it surfaced. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If I suddenly expressed strong dissatisfaction, it wouldn't just be about that one issue. It would disrupt the entire identity he had assigned to me. And that's when a subtle but powerful awareness formed. I wasn't just being dismissed in isolated moments. I had been cast reliable, useful, emotionally contained, invisible in all the ways that would make someone uncomfortable. And the most unsettling part, I had participated in the casting. I had rewarded his comfort with my silence. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you see the role you're playing, you have two options. Continue performing it, or quietly step out of character. I didn't know yet what stepping out would look like, but for the first time, I understood that the script wasn't fixed. And that understanding was the first real shift inside me. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a cruel comment or a dramatic betrayal. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the kind that looks harmless in memory. He was in the living room watching a game, volume slightly too loud. I was at the dining table with my laptop open, reviewing a certification module I'd been slowly working through for months. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't required for my job. I was doing it because I wanted to expand my qualifications, because I liked growing. At some point, he muted the TV and walked over. "You're still doing that thing?" he asked, nodding toward my screen. "Yeah," I said lightly. "I'm almost done with this section." He leaned over my shoulder, scanning the text for less than 5 seconds. "Is it even going to change anything career-wise?" The question wasn't aggressive. It was practical. But there was something in the tone, something dismissive disguised as efficiency. "I think so," I replied. "It opens a few doors." He shrugged. "Just don't burn yourself out over something that won't matter." Won't matter. I don't know why that phrase lingered longer than the others had. Maybe because it touched something deeper. This wasn't about dinner timing or jokes in front of friends. This was about my growth, my ambition, my internal world. I closed the laptop gently. "Why do you assume it won't matter?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He looked surprised by the question. "I don't assume that," he said. "I'm just saying, you already have a stable job. Not everything has to be optimized." Optimized, as if my curiosity was an inefficiency. For a moment, I felt the familiar impulse to smooth it over, to say he was right, to minimize my own desire. But instead, I stayed quiet, not withdrawn, not angry, just still. He waited for me to respond. When I didn't, he returned to the couch. The game resumed, and I sat there, staring at the closed laptop. It wasn't what he said. It was the pattern of positioning. My feelings were dramatic. My interpretations were exaggerated. My ambitions were unnecessary. Each time, he framed it as practicality, and each time I adjusted. But that afternoon, something inside me refused to adjust. For the first time, I didn't reinterpret his comment to protect the relationship. I interpreted it to protect myself. I asked myself a question I had never allowed myself before. What if I'm not too sensitive? What if I'm accurately sensing a dynamic that doesn't serve me? That thought didn't ignite anger. It ignited clarity. I walked to the bedroom and took out my journal. I wrote for almost an hour, not about him, about me, what I wanted, what I had minimized, what I had postponed because it felt extra. And as I wrote, I noticed something startling. My handwriting was steadier than usual. There was no emotional surge, no trembling doubt, just a quiet acknowledgement. I have been shrinking to maintain comfort, and no one has asked me to stop. That was the shift. Not confrontation, not tears. Just the realization that my silence had stopped being generosity and started becoming self-erasure. From that day forward, I didn't argue anymore. I didn't suddenly demand change. I simply stopped automatically conceding. I began observing without correcting, listening without defending, noticing without excusing, and that subtle internal repositioning changed the texture of everything. He didn't feel it at first. Why would he? Externally, I was still composed, still calm, still the steady one, but internally, something fundamental had realigned. I was no longer trying to prove that my reactions were reasonable. I was evaluating whether the dynamic itself was, and once that question enters your mind, it doesn't leave quietly. It waits, and it sharpens. Before that Sunday, my silence had been automatic. After it, my silence became deliberate. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. When he interrupted me in conversation now, I didn't rush to reclaim the floor. I let him finish. I watched how easily he assumed authority over my narrative. I noticed who looked at him and who looked back at me. Observation replaced reaction. When he reframed something I said, "What Morgan means is..." I didn't correct him immediately. I stored the moment, not as ammunition, as data. At dinner with friends one Friday night, someone asked about my certification again. Before I could answer, he said, "She's exploring it. We'll see if it sticks." "We'll see," as if my effort required group validation. Everyone smiled politely. The conversation moved on. I didn't feel the old sting. Instead, I felt something cooler. Clarity. Later, in the car, he commented, You were quiet tonight." I was listening, I said. He glanced at me. "You seemed distant." That word hung in the air. Distant. It was the first time he'd labeled a shift in me. "I'm just thinking more," I replied. "About what?" "About what I want long term." That made him laugh softly. "You always think long term." But this time, I didn't laugh with him. Because this wasn't abstract thinking anymore. It was an assessment. Silence, when chosen, becomes strategic. I stopped volunteering emotional labor automatically. If he vented about work, I listened, but I no longer offered 3 solutions and a reframed perspective unless he asked if plans changed at the last minute. I adjusted, but I stopped pretending it didn't matter. I simply said, "Okay," without cushioning it, without adding, "It's totally fine." There's a subtle difference between acceptance and endorsement. He began to sense it. One evening, after I responded briefly to something he'd said, he asked, "Are you upset with me?" "No," I answered honestly. I'm not upset. And I wasn't. Anger had faded into something far more powerful. Detachment. Not coldness. Just distance from the constant need to be understood. When you stop trying to convince someone of your emotional reality, you free up an enormous amount of energy. I redirected that energy inward. I revisited my finances. Quietly. I requested more detailed access to our joint accounts under the pretense of organizing things better. I finished my certification module. I researched additional credentials. Not in secret. Just without commentary. He mistook my restraint for contentment. That's the thing about people who are used to you accommodating them when you stop resisting. They assume harmony. They don't realize you've simply moved the negotiation inside yourself. There was a night he reached for me in bed and paused. "You feel different," he said quietly. How, I asked? "I don't know. Less reactive." I turned toward him. "Maybe I'm just more certain." He searched my face for a moment, trying to decode what that meant. But certainty doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like stillness. He kissed my forehead and said, "I like it when things are calm." I almost smiled at the irony, because calm was no longer something I was manufacturing for him. It was something I was building for myself, and he didn't yet understand the difference. Silence used to be my way of preserving the relationship. Now it was my way of preparing for whatever came next. Not revenge, not punishment, just readiness. Because when you finally stop arguing your worth out loud, you begin proving it quietly, and quiet preparation is rarely visible until it's irreversible. If someone had looked at my life from the outside during that period, they would have seen nothing unusual. We still hosted dinners. We still split errands. We still posted the occasional photo, a hike, a holiday, a smiling anniversary caption. There was no visible fracture. But internally, I had shifted from participant to observer. And observers notice patterns that participants excuse. I started small. First, I finished my certification, not just completing the modules, but excelling in them. I reached out to 2 mentors in my firm and asked more pointed questions about growth paths. I volunteered for projects that expanded my portfolio instead of just maintaining operations. At home, I asked to review our financial accounts more closely. "I should probably understand everything if something ever happened to you," I said lightly one evening. He laughed. "What's going to happen to me?" "Nothing," I replied. "But I like knowing how things work." He didn't resist. Why would he? It sounded responsible. He forwarded me the login details, walked me through spreadsheets, explained investment allocations with the same confident tone he used when he thought he was simplifying something for me. I listened carefully. I didn't challenge. I didn't correct. I didn't reveal how much I already understood. I just documented, not because I was planning an escape, because I was done being uninformed. The journal entries changed too. They became less emotional and more analytical. Instead of writing, I felt dismissed. I wrote, "Pattern, he reframes my concerns as exaggerations when they require behavioral change." Instead of "I'm hurt," I wrote, "Dynamic, my requests are categorized as emotional rather than practical." It sounds clinical, but that objectivity was stabilizing. Emotion clouds clarity. Documentation sharpens it. I also began tracking something I had never consciously measured before: reciprocity. If I adjusted plans 3 times in a month, how many times did he? If I initiated emotional check-ins, how often did he? If I supported his growth, did he invest equal curiosity into mine? Not in a scorekeeping way, in a pattern recognition way, and the patterns were consistent. Effort flowed primarily in one direction from me outward. Meanwhile, something else was happening that he didn't notice. I was rebuilding my internal authority. For years, whenever he said, "You're overthinking," I paused to evaluate whether I was. Now, when he said it, I thought, or maybe I'm thinking exactly the right amount. When he said, "It's not that serious," I thought, "It may not be serious to you." That mental correction, silent or invisible, was powerful. I stopped outsourcing my emotional interpretation. There was one particular evening that crystallized how much I had changed. We were at a small gathering. Someone mentioned long-term marriage being about compromise. He nodded and said, "Morgan's great at compromise. She doesn't sweat the small stuff." A few people smiled at me approvingly. Old me would have accepted that description. New me recognized the narrative embedded in it. I tilted my head slightly and said, evenly, "I think I'm great at evaluating which things are actually small." The table went quiet for half a second. Not tense, just recalibrating. He laughed it off. See, overthinking. But I didn't smile this time. I held eye contact. Not aggressive, just steady. And for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger, not fear, uncertainty. He wasn't used to me subtly redefining myself in real time. That's what they never noticed. While they believed I was staying quiet to maintain peace, I was actually repositioning, financially informed, professionally expanding, emotionally self-validating. Preparation doesn't always look like packing a suitcase. Sometimes it looks like learning how every lock in the house works. Sometimes it looks like knowing exactly where the light switches are before anyone else realizes the power might go out. I wasn't plotting. I was stabilizing myself independent of him. And the more stable I became internally, the less his interpretations defined me. He still believed I was the steady one, the easy one, the woman who didn't create complications. He didn't realize that the steadiness he relied on was no longer anchored to him. It was anchored to something far more durable, me. And once that foundation is rebuilt quietly, the next step isn't impulsive, it's deliberate. There wasn't a dramatic discovery, no hidden messages, no secret accounts, no betrayal that would justify an explosion. The revelation was quieter than that. It happened on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing our financial documents alone at the dining table. I had grown accustomed to looking through everything carefully: investment statements, retirement accounts, insurance policies, not suspiciously, just thoroughly. For years, he had handled most of it, not because I couldn't, but because it was more efficient that way. Now that I had full visibility, I began to see something else. Not deception, imbalance. Our contributions to certain long-term assets weren't structured the way I had assumed. Some accounts were primarily in his name. Some automatic transfers favored his retirement growth at a slightly higher percentage than mine. It wasn't malicious. It had been framed years ago as tax optimization, logical, practical, but the cumulative effect was clear. If something fractured between us, I would be less insulated. Not powerless, but less protected than he was. I sat there for a long time, staring at the spreadsheet. I didn't feel anger. I felt awake, because for the first time, I wasn't interpreting our marriage emotionally. I was evaluating it structurally. Emotionally, I had done most of the adjusting. Structurally, he had done most of the securing. That asymmetry was subtle, but it was real. And once you see a structural imbalance, you can't unsee it. I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence. Stability should not depend on his continued goodwill. That was the private reveal. Not that he was cruel, not that he was secretly plotting, but that our entire dynamic, emotional and financial, assumed I would remain the accommodating constant, the steady baseline, the woman who trusted the framework without auditing it. I began researching quietly. Not divorce, not separation, just information. What are the legal defaults in our state? How are joint assets evaluated? What protections exist for long-term spouses? I didn't tell anyone I was reading these things. Not because I was ashamed, but clarity doesn't require an audience. The more I learned, the calmer I became. Options create calm. Dependence creates anxiety. That's something no one teaches you directly. One night, he mentioned casually that a colleague's wife had blindsided him with the separation after acting fine for months. He shook his head. I don't get how someone can pretend like that. I watched him carefully. Maybe she wasn't pretending, I said evenly. Maybe she was processing. He frowned slightly. Still feels deceptive. I didn't argue. Because what I understood and what he didn't was that silence can mean many things. It can mean confusion. It can mean fear. It can mean calculation. In my case, it meant assessment. The private reveal wasn't about catching him in wrongdoing. It was about recognizing that I had built my life around being reasonable, and reasonability had quietly reduced my leverage. I didn't celebrate this awareness. There was no triumphant feeling, just a sober recognition. If I ever chose to leave, I would need to be prepared in ways I had never considered before. And if I chose to stay, it would need to be from strength, not inertia. For years, I had asked myself, am I overreacting? Now I was asking a different question. If nothing changes, can I respect the version of myself who stays? That question didn't create panic. It created direction. Because once you see the architecture of your own life, clearly, emotionally, and financially, you realize something profound. You are not trapped, but you are responsible. And responsibility, when fully accepted, eliminates excuses. From that point on, I wasn't reacting to his behavior. I was preparing for my own decision, and decisions made in clarity rarely require noise. Clarity doesn't rush you. That's something I learned in the months after my private reveals. There was no ticking clock, no dramatic deadline, just a quiet awareness that I now had enough information to choose, and that not choosing was, in itself, a choice. I gave myself time, not to gather more evidence, but to observe whether anything naturally recalibrated once I stopped overcompensating. At first, nothing changed. He still interrupted occasionally, still reframed my concerns as overthinking, still assumed leadership in decisions by default. But now, I wasn't absorbing it the same way. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't internalizing. I wasn't arguing. I was measuring. There were 3 paths in front of me. The first was the most familiar: stay exactly as we were. Continue being steady. Accept that this was simply our dynamic. Many marriages operate on uneven emotional distribution. Maybe this was normal. The second was confrontation. Lay everything out. Present patterns. Demand change. Risk being labeled dramatic again, but push through it this time. The third was quieter. Rebalance my life so thoroughly that staying or leaving would no longer feel like survival, just preference. I examined each option honestly. If I confronted him directly, what would happen? He would likely defend. He might adjust temporarily. He might even try sincerely for a while. But the underlying narrative that I was prone to overinterpretation would always linger in the background. I would spend energy proving my perceptions were valid. I was tired of proving. If I stayed without change, what would happen? Nothing catastrophic. Just a slow continuation of erosion. I would become increasingly composed, increasingly distant, increasingly smaller inside myself. And then one day, years later, I might wake up next to a man who believed we had always been fine. That future frightened me more than confrontation did, which left the third option, not a dramatic exit, not explosive revelation, but irreversible repositioning. I didn't frame it as a divorce in my mind at first. I framed it as independence. I began separating small financial streams. I increased my personal savings rate. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer not to file anything, just to understand the landscape. I didn't tell him about that meeting, not because I was hiding, because I was clarifying. The lawyer didn't ask if I was angry. She didn't ask if he had cheated. She asked practical questions about assets, duration of marriage, and income ratios. When I left her office, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt informed. And information is stabilizing. That evening, he asked casually, "How was your day?" "Productive," I answered. It wasn't a lie. Over the next few weeks, I continued moving quietly, not draining accounts, not making ultimatums, just ensuring that if I ever chose to step away, I wouldn't be negotiating from emotional exhaustion or financial confusion. The decision point wasn't one singular moment. It was a narrowing, a gradual understanding that I no longer wanted to be understood within a framework that minimized me. I wanted to exist without constant reinterpretation. One night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. I asked myself one final question. If he never changes, not maliciously, just fundamentally, can I stay without losing respect for myself? The answer came calmly, no. There were no tears when I realized it, no surge of rage, just a steady acceptance that love, without mutual recognition, eventually becomes maintenance. And I was done maintaining a version of myself that required constant editing. That was the decision. Not fueled by anger, not triggered by betrayal, simply chosen. And once chosen internally, everything else became logistics. Once the decision settled inside me, the emotional turbulence I expected never came. Instead, there was a strange, almost clinical calm. I wasn't grieving yet. I wasn't relieved either. I was focused. The first thing I did was restructure my direct deposits. A small percentage of my paycheck, nothing alarming, began flowing into a personal account I had opened months earlier. It wasn't secret in the legal sense, just separate, clear, mine. I updated my certification credentials on professional platforms, reached out to a recruiter who had contacted me the previous year and said, "I'm open to conversations now." I wasn't running from something. I was expanding toward something. At home, nothing dramatic shifted. I still made coffee in the mornings, still asked about his meetings, still folded laundry beside him on Sundays. The difference was invisible. I was no longer investing emotional surplus into smoothing the edges. When he forgot a small promise, I didn't compensate for it. I let the gap exist. When he dismissed a nuance in conversation, I didn't circle back later to explain myself more clearly. I let the misinterpretation sit, not out of pettiness, out of conservation. There's a powerful shift that happens when you stop trying to manage how someone sees you. Your energy returns to you. I scheduled another meeting with the lawyer this time to discuss timelines. No paperwork filed yet, just strategy. "What's your goal?" she asked gently. "Clarity," I answered. She nodded, then moved deliberately. That word stayed with me, deliberately. At home, he began noticing subtle differences, but he couldn't name them. "You seem busy lately," he said one evening. "I am," I replied. "With what?" "Work, planning, thinking." He laughed softly. "You and your long-term thinking." This time, I didn't downplay it. "Yes," I said, "exactly." I started decluttering my personal items, not dramatically packing, just organizing. Important documents were scanned and stored, copies secured, passwords updated. Every action was legal, methodical, calm. There were nights when I looked at him across the dinner table and felt a flicker of sadness, not because I doubted my decision, but because I understood something he didn't. He still believed we were stable because there was no conflict. He equated silence with satisfaction, and I had once helped him believe that. That realization didn't make me cruel. It made me careful. I chose my timing based on logistics, not emotion. Lease renewal dates, tax considerations, professional transitions, strategic, not reactive. Meanwhile, I accepted a new role at work, a lateral move with higher long-term earning potential. He congratulated me. "See," he said, "all that thinking paid off." I held his gaze. "Yes," I answered. "It did." He didn't know how many layers that statement carried. By the time I was ready to formally initiate separation proceedings, nothing in my external demeanor suggested rupture. No screaming matches, no accusations, just a quiet certainty. Moving in silence isn't about deception. It's about alignment. When you've spent years being interpreted incorrectly, you learn the value of acting without commentary, because commentary invites reframing. Action finalizes. And by the time I made the first official call to begin paperwork, I wasn't emotional. I was prepared. There's a misconception that leaving requires fury. Sometimes it only requires completion. And I was complete. The first visible consequence wasn't legal paperwork. It was an absence. Not physical absence, energetic absence. When you stop overfunctioning in a relationship, the imbalance becomes visible almost immediately, but only to the person who benefited from it. He noticed it in small ways. One evening, he came home frustrated about work and began venting the way he always had, pacing slightly, voice animated, expecting my usual steady stream of reassurance and strategic reframing. I listened. I nodded. But I didn't dissect the situation for him. I didn't build a solution scaffold. After a few minutes, he paused. "That's it," he asked lightly. "What do you mean?" I replied. "You don't have thoughts." "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said calmly. It wasn't cold. It was respectful. He frowned slightly, unsettled. In the following weeks, similar moments accumulated. When he forgot to book something we had loosely discussed, I didn't quietly make the reservation myself. If he interrupted me in conversation, I didn't circle back later to clarify my position. If he made a joke at my expense, I didn't smile automatically. I simply didn't perform the emotional cushioning anymore, and he began to feel something was missing. One night, while we were brushing our teeth side by side, he asked, "Are you unhappy?" The question lingered in the mirror between us. I met his eyes. "I'm evaluating," I said. "Evaluating what?" "Us." He laughed softly, as if trying to neutralize the tension. "That sounds ominous." "It's not," I replied evenly. "It's honest." He didn't press further, but something shifted in his posture. Consequences rarely start with explosions. They begin with discomfort. He started initiating more conversations. "Did I say something wrong earlier? Are you sure you're okay?" "You feel different." Each time, I answered truthfully but minimally. "I'm fine. I'm thinking I'm just more aware lately." Awareness is hard to argue with. Meanwhile, the legal process had quietly begun. Preliminary filing, financial disclosure, structured steps. He didn't know yet. I wasn't waiting for the perfect emotional moment to tell him. I was waiting for procedural readiness. There was one evening when the absence became unmistakable. We were at a dinner with friends. He told a story he'd told before, one where I usually chimed in to add context or smooth out a detail. This time, I stayed silent. When he finished, one of our friends looked at me and said, "Morgan, is that how it happened?" I paused. "No," I said gently. "Not exactly." The table went quiet for a second. Not tense, just recalibrating. He glanced at me, surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked, unsmiling tightly. "I remember it differently," I replied, "but it's not important. Except it was not the story itself, the act of not automatically validating his version." On the drive home, he was unusually quiet. "You've been contradicting me more lately," he said finally. "I've been speaking," I corrected calmly. He didn't respond. That was when the consequences truly began. Not because I attacked, not because I accused, but because I stopped reinforcing the narrative that kept me small. When someone has grown accustomed to your emotional labor, your withdrawal feels like a loss even if you're still physically present. He couldn't yet articulate what was slipping. He just knew something was, and I knew something else. By the time I told him the full truth, he would already feel the shift had happened long ago. By the time I told him, he already sensed it. Not the legal specifics, not the timeline, but the finality. It was a Wednesday evening. Ordinary. I chose it intentionally. No anniversaries, no holidays, no emotionally charged dates that would forever stain the calendar. We had finished dinner. Dishes were still in the sink. "I filed for separation," I said calmly. No preamble, no dramatic build-up, just truth. He blinked once, as if his brain needed an extra second to process the sentence. "You what?" "I filed last week. You'll be formally notified in a few days." The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was disorienting. "You're serious," he said slowly. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the kitchen. "Where's this coming from?" he asked. "We haven't even been fighting." That sentence, "We haven't even been fighting." I had anticipated it. "That's part of it," I replied. He looked at me like I'd spoken another language. "So this is about what? A rough patch. We can fix that." I shook my head gently. "It's not a patch." His voice sharpened slightly. "Then what is it?" "Morgan." Because from my perspective, things have been normal. Normal. There it was again, the baseline he had relied on for years. "I stopped feeling hurt a long time ago," I said evenly, and I kept adjusting instead of addressing it. He stared at me. "You never said it was this serious." I answered in small ways. "That's not the same as saying you're thinking of leaving." He wasn't wrong, but he was late. There's a difference between warning someone and convincing them. I had spent years attempting the latter. Now I was done attempting either. He shifted tactics. "I can change," he said quickly. "If this is about me interrupting you or minimizing things, I didn't realize it mattered this much." "I know," I said softly. That was the truth. He hadn't realized, because I had absorbed the impact quietly. "I'll go to counseling," he continued. "We can restructure finances, whatever you want. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like rapid negotiation." For a moment, I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to reassure him, to soften the blow, to manage his fear. Instead, I stayed still. "I believe you would try," I said carefully, "but I don't want a version of you that's performing awareness because I'm halfway out the door." He looked wounded. "So you're not even giving me the chance?" "I gave chances," I replied. "They just didn't look dramatic." The room felt smaller, not hostile, just heavy. He sat down at the table and covered his face briefly. I thought we were solid, he said quietly. We were stable, I corrected. That's different. He looked up at me, then really looked, and I think in that moment he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not hysteria, not impulsiveness. Resolve. The kind that doesn't argue, the kind that has already processed grief in private. You've already decided, he said. Yes, there are moments in life where repair is possible, and then there are moments when repair becomes reactionary. He was offering repair in response to loss, but I needed recognition before the loss, and that window had closed long before this conversation. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't cruel. He was simply accustomed to a version of me that no longer existed. And by the time he understood the depth of the shift, I was already standing somewhere he couldn't reach with promises. Too late doesn't always mean malicious. Sometimes it just means misaligned timing. And timing, once past, doesn't rewind. In the weeks that followed, there were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, just conversations that felt like post-mortems. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where I had once reviewed spreadsheets quietly and talked in measured tones about a marriage that was still technically intact, but already concluded. I wish you had told me sooner, he said one evening. I did, I replied. Not like this. He meant not in a way that forced him to take it seriously, and that was the part we kept circling. You frame my concerns as overreactions, I said calmly. After a while, I stopped presenting them as concerns. I didn't mean to dismiss you. I know. That answer unsettled him more than the accusation would have. Because if he had meant to hurt me, the narrative would be cleaner. He could apologize, label it a flaw, and promise correction. But unintended patterns are harder to confront. They require deeper self-examination. You're acting as if I controlled you, he said at one point. You could have pushed back harder. He wasn't entirely wrong. I could have, I acknowledged. But I shouldn't have had to fight to be taken seriously. He looked down at his hands. The tone between us never escalated. It didn't need to. Heat implies volatility. This was something else, a quiet reckoning. One afternoon, he asked, Are you happier now? The question surprised me. I'm clearer, I answered. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed, but it's closer to peace. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. There were moments when I saw genuine regret in him. Not performative desperation, real reflection. He started interrupting himself mid-sentence sometimes. Catching it, sorry, he'd say, go ahead. Months ago, that would have meant everything to me. Now, it felt like proof of something bittersweet. He was capable of change, but only after the consequence. And I had learned something about myself through all of this. I no longer wanted to be the catalyst for someone else's growth at the expense of my own. One night, as we discussed dividing certain belongings, he paused and said quietly, You don't seem angry at me. I'm not, I said truthfully. You should be. Why? Because I missed it. I missed you pulling away. I considered that. I didn't pull away, I said gently. I stepped back. What's the difference? When you pull away, you're hoping someone will chase you, I explained. When you step back, you're deciding where you stand. He didn't argue. There was no dramatic confrontation where I listed grievances. No long speech cataloging every dismissal. Because this wasn't about scoring emotional points. It was about alignment. And alignment can't be negotiated once one person has fully shifted. In our final week under the same roof, we had dinner together one last time. It was quiet, respectful, familiar. As we cleared the plates, he said, I never thought calm could be this final. Neither had I. For years, calm had meant compromise. Now, it meant closure. No heat, no spectacle. Just two people acknowledging that something essential had been misunderstood for too long. And understanding it now didn't rewind time. It simply clarified the ending. I live alone now. A smaller place, more light, fewer compromises in the furniture. The maple tree stayed with the house. I thought I would miss it more than I do. What I actually notice most is the quiet. Not the heavy quiet that used to sit between unspoken things. A clean quiet, the kind that doesn't require interpretation. In the months after the separation was finalized, people asked careful questions. Are you okay? Was it sudden? Did something happen? I answered simply. Nothing dramatic. I would say, just clarity. Some people seemed unsatisfied with that. They wanted a sharper story, a clear villain, a singular betrayal they could wrap their understanding around. But the truth is less cinematic. No one cheated. No one screamed. No one slammed doors. I just stopped negotiating my own perception. Work changed, too. The certification I once pursued quietly led to a new role. More responsibility, more visibility. When I speak in meetings now, I don't pre-edit my tone for palatability. I don't soften conclusions before presenting them. And something interesting happened. No one labeled me dramatic. No one told me I was overthinking. They listened. It wasn't that the world had changed. It was that I had stopped framing myself as optional. There are evenings when I sit at my kitchen counter with my black journal open, the same one that once held careful documentation of dismissal. The entries are different now. Less analysis, more intention. What do I want next? Where do I feel most alive? Am I honoring my own voice today? I don't write about him much. Not because I'm suppressing anything, but because I don't feel pulled backward. There's no bitterness in me. That surprised me. I thought there would be anger waiting once the dust settled. Instead, there's something steadier. Self-trust. That's the identity I gained. For years, I outsourced my emotional calibration. I double-checked my reactions against someone else's interpretation. Now, when something feels off, I examine it, but I don't immediately discredit it. I don't rush to make myself smaller for the sake of harmony. Harmony that requires self-erasure isn't harmony. It's compliance. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still deliberating. Those traits didn't disappear. They just belong to me now, not to a role I was playing. Sometimes I think about the woman I was in that house, the one who filtered her feelings through invisible approval panels. I don't judge her. She was surviving the only way she knew how. But I'm not her anymore. Now, when someone interrupts me, I finish my sentence. When someone reframes my words incorrectly, I correct them gently. When something matters to me, I say so even if it's inconvenient. I'm not louder. I'm clearer. And clarity has a different kind of presence. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't seek validation. It simply stands. Who I am now isn't a reaction to him. It's a return to myself. And that return required no fireworks. Just a quiet refusal to keep disappearing. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Disconnection doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in gently, disguised as maturity, as a compromise, as being the bigger person. For years, I believed love meant adjusting faster than the other person, interpreting generously, absorbing friction before it became conflict. And there's value in patience. There's value in grace. But there's a line, and it's thinner than we admit, between grace and self-erasure. I didn't leave because of one argument. I didn't leave because of cruelty. I left because I realized I'd slowly trained someone to believe that my internal world required less space than his. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just gradually. The most dangerous dismissals aren't explosive. They're casual. It's not that serious. You're overthinking. You're reading into it. When you hear those often enough, you start editing yourself before you speak. And once you start editing yourself to be easier to love, you have to ask, who is benefiting from that version of you? I don't tell this story to paint him as a villain. He was comfortable, and I was complicit in maintaining that comfort. The turning point wasn't anger. It was a responsibility. I stopped asking whether my feelings were reasonable enough to present. I started asking whether the dynamic was sustainable for me. That shift changed everything. Quiet dominance isn't about revenge. It's about alignment. It's about preparing your life so thoroughly that your decisions are rooted in clarity, not chaos. It's about choosing yourself without humiliating someone else. And most importantly, it's about understanding that silence can be two very different things. One kind of silence shrinks you. The other kind builds you. The difference is whether you're staying quiet to keep the peace or staying quiet because you're preparing to move with certainty. If you've ever been told you're too sensitive, if you've ever felt alone in a relationship that looked stable from the outside, if you've ever wondered whether you're overreacting or simply underheard, I'm curious. At what point does patience stop being love and start becoming self-abandonment? I'd really like to know what you think.